Greg Wrubell, the voice of BYU Athletics, joins us after their huge win, an emphatic win against Kansas State over the weekend, and now coming back to Waco. They've been here before recently. The year, in fact, it was announced they would be joining the Big Ten. Greg, thank you very much for your time. I got to tell you, Kalani Sitake and the Cougars look really good in all the phases. And what has been, at least up until now, in your opinion, the difference?
Much more consistent play defensively. I think this defense is for real. They've played 4 teams so far, 2 power conference teams, and 2 pretty good offenses in SMU and Kansas State. Neither team got into the end zone. SMU was held to 5 field goals. Same SMU team that put up 66 on TCU on Saturday. So I think if you can keep SMU and K-State out of the end zone, be where they are right now in terms of pass efficiency defense, red zone defense, they look to be for real. Jay Hill's in his second year as defensive coordinator. Kalani said it would take some time for the thing to start really clicking. Year 1 was a learning experience for Jay as a new coordinator with BYU, for his players with him. And much of these guys are back in the same scheme under Coach Hill in year 2. So I think that's a big part of it, is how consistent they've been defensively. The offense has been okay, good enough to win 4 games. But I think right now the defense is kind of carrying this team. And then when you add on the fact they've now scored special teams touchdowns in back-to-back weeks against Wyoming, first kickoff return touchdown in 10 years. And then last week against K-State, first punt return touchdown in 11 years. So you go a decade without them, and then you get them in back-to-back weeks. That's been helpful as well. And I think Jake Retzloff, the quarterback, year 1 to year 2. In year 1, he comes in as a replacement starter for an injured Keaton Slovis and goes 0-4 in his starts. This year, as the veteran guy, his team hasn't lost a game with him at the helm. He beat out Gary Bohannon, former Baylor Bear, for the quarterback job. And I think Gary was brought in with the thought that this could be the guy with 1 year left to play. Jake would have had to play really well to beat Gary Bohannon out. That's exactly what he did.
Greg, everybody we talked to, I think including you, when we asked, how do you feel about this team going into the season, was kind of answered incomplete. Don't know. How much of that was not knowing how good the defense was going to be in year 2 and how much they had grasped that system, and how much just you needed to see something on the field about this team's moxie, and even though they're not a veteran-laden team, they seem to play like it.
Well, a lot centered on the quarterback question. You didn't know it was going to be a true competition between Jake Retzloff and Gary Bohannon. And I would say 2 weeks into camp, it still wasn't decided. I think Jake really pulled ahead toward the end of camp. So a lot of the uncertainty was based on the identity of the starting quarterback. You kind of knew whoever it was, he'd have a good crew of wide receivers around him, pretty good tight end room, and a lot of guys in the running back room with a couple of returning vets. Interestingly, both those guys have missed the last 2 games. And so BYU's gotten through that as well. So once the quarterback thing got figured out, I think you felt that, okay, let's see how this thing comes together with the experience at the skill positions around him. Jake would have to be better, and he is and has been. Defensively, I think was where the biggest question lied, where was how would the team perform in year 2 with Jay's scheme. And parenthetically, the secondary, which is usually a question mark at BYU, has been less of one this year. Jacob Robinson really locking things down as the one DB that people kind of knew about and talked about. But people like Evan Johnson have played well opposite him. Maury Bamba gets back off injury this past week and plays some meaningful reps. The safety room uses a lot of guys, but Raider Namouni is kind of emerging as a marquee safety, and then a couple of freshmen, including Tommy Prasis, who scored that scoop and score touchdown for BYU last week, have also performed well in the secondary out of the safety spot. So there were questions to answer. Some were personnel related, but most were scheme related in terms of how would that second year scheme kind of click with these guys under Jay Hill.
The big return. Take us through from your standpoint, watching that unfold. I mean, I was sitting there at my sister's house with my brother-in-law, and clearly things are already all in BYU's favor, and then Parker Knighton busts this thing loose, and we were actually trying to figure out how many yards he actually ran. And I think SportsCenter afterwards actually did it, and it was like 150-plus yards on that return. But what a thing of beauty. Just What was that like from your standpoint, and just a massive play for the Cougs?
Yeah, we broke it down to 136 yards. SportsCenter had it 137. They were close. We were both right in the same neighborhood. Yeah, Parker Kingston is a wide receiver and a pretty good one for BYU, but track speed got him on the team. He made it to the team because of his exploits as a track star in high school. When that punt left the foot of the punter, it looked like he kind of misjudged it. That it had a lot more carry than he thought it would have. And yeah, he had to retreat to catch it. Anytime you turn your back to the punter, the question is, do you try and take a stab at it, go Willie Mays, or do you let it go and eat the fact that you're probably going to be inside your 10 or 5 yard line? Well, he chose to give it a stab and got enough of it to make it a muff. Once he touched it, he knew I better get it. And he got a really nice dribble. I mean, there was a bounce there at the end that had, the football is a prolate spheroid. It's not a ball. It's not a true round ball. It could go anywhere. And that last bounce got right into his lap. And once that happened, then the track instincts kicked in, and it was they were playing a game of tag at that point, and he was just trying to avoid as many people as possible. Then the blockers picked up, and then the return was actually set to the sideline that he went to. That was kind of helpful. BYU actually had on a safe return there. The regular defense was on the field guarding for a fake, so they didn't have the typical special teams unit out there. So that's also a cool part of it too, is that this was kind of a make it up on the fly return in a lot of ways. And once he got to the sideline, nice selection of white shirts around him, some nice key blocks made, some shielding blocks were made, but it was Parker Kingston's speed that took over. And at that point, things had begun to kind of turn BYU's way in a big way. And that just kind of added to the momentum, the latest big play. The place was rocking. It was sold out, 64,000 people. And that just kind of, that was just kind of the capper, if you will, of the momentum type surge they had against K-State. And then, he just laid it all out there. You could see the sideline shot of him getting sick after the return. Yeah. He just ran forever, right? And at full speed. And there were a lot of cool aspects to it. But the fact that BYU's put together special teams touchdowns in back-to-back weeks is a big part of why they're 4-0 too.
I don't know the stat, but I would love to know. And I've heard that it's a pretty high percentage that when anyone muffs a kick, that the percentages of scoring are better than if everything was clean. Because the coverage team kind of hesitates for a second. You kind of get out of your lane or you get out of your focus. That was just a remarkable play. So last year was hard. This year, the expectations based on whoever, probably I think it's fair to say we're not good. How refreshing has this been the first month of the year with what they've done?
Yeah, last year's finish was hard, because they got to 5-2 at one point. That was the team that looked like they were going to get to a bowl game in their first year in a power conference. But from 5-2, the wheels kind of came off. The Keaton Slovis injury was a part of it. The schedule toughened up. That was a big part of it. You're having to play at Texas. You had Oklahoma. You had a good TCU team at that time. You had Oklahoma State. You had Iowa State. The schedule got tough at the wrong time for that team. They were kind of getting beat up by that point, and that sixth win never came. They went from 5-2 to 5-7, finished the game on a 5-game losing streak. That 5-game losing streak may end up being a blessing in disguise. While you never want to go 5-7 and lose 5 in a row, I think it caused some changes to be made that have paid dividends for BYU, a new O-line coach, a new tight end coach, and an overall mentality of we've got to make a statement this year that we are not who people think we were based on last year. It's a proud team that makes a bold. Bold misses are rare. This team plays in the postseason, and so there's a lot of that going on right now, and you really do get the sense that they think that 4-0 doesn't nearly, the job's not nearly close to done at 4-0. There's a lot left to be done because they know where they were last year at 3-0 and then 5-2. So it's the next weekly statement now, and it comes at Baylor. And there's some things to actually, battle right now for BYU. BYU, this game last week, kicked at 8:35 Mountain Time, which is 9:35 K-State body clock time. All right, that was an unfamiliar thing for K-State, but a really familiar thing for BYU. They play a lot of these late night games, being in that window, and the Cougars excel at night. You go back over the last X number of seasons, last 27 games, they're 24-3 in night games. and then you flip it, and they're 2-12 in their last 14 day games. They've lost their last 10 day games against FBS opponents. Now, to be fair, one of the reasons you get into that daytime window is you get the ABC or the or the early ESP. You're playing a better team usually. When you get the afternoon call, usually playing a pretty good team, and there have been some good teams there. That said, 10 straight losses is 10 straight losses. So they're killing it at night, and they're struggling in the day. So this is an opportunity now to go into Waco and prove that you can maybe exercise a couple of those early day demons. It's a 10 a.m. Mountain Time body clock kick for BYU. So some hurdles to overcome, but an interesting kind of side trend, if you will, which was as good as they've been at night. They've had their struggles in the daytime.
Greg, they call that Dracula syndrome. That's what that.
Say the vampire.
They call them the vampire Cougs. They're the vampire Cougs right now.
Yeah. Baylor is coming off a gut-wrenching loss.
Yeah.
BYU is coming off an exhilarating blowout win.
Right.
How do they not overreact to the fact that Baylor is on the mat a little bit and that they are flying high?
Yeah, and then that was the theme I think coaches wanted to hit pretty early was, okay, now that we're 4-0, how do we stay hungry? How do we stay humble? And look at Baylor as not a team that's, in disarray after a heartbreaking loss, but a team that's going to redouble its efforts and play with a modicum of desperation. And I know that in speaking with BYU's OC this morning on our weekly TV show, he said they expect a great Baylor team on Saturday. He said that loss will he thinks would affect Baylor from their standpoint in a positive way to really kind of, again, redouble those efforts and not let things go south. And so I don't think there's much of a danger if the coaches have their way of BYU looking past a 2-2 Baylor team. The Cougs have never won in Waco. They lost the game way back in 1983, but then the game they're most familiar with was the 2021 outing. And that was a game where the trenches were decidedly in Baylor's favor that day. And I think that game back in 2021 was really instructive and helpful as BYU made that transition into Big 12 play as an example of that was a Big 12 team that showed us what it takes to win up front Big 12 football games. And so knowing they were going in 22, they beat Baylor in Provo. It was a much closer game, went to overtime. And now they're getting a sense now, second year in the Big 12, of what it does take to win power conference football games. Because last year's power conference grind took its toll on BYU. They played 10 straight power conference games, beat Arkansas and Fayetteville, then went 2-7 in their 9 Big 12 games. I think they've learned a lot from that. But I think that Baylor game back in 21 was maybe the first indicator of, okay, where do we have to get better from BYU perspective? Where do we have to get better, to be able to win games in this kind of league?
Well, yeah, and Kalani has made that comment, no question. He's told us that. Even when we've had him on, we've been fortunate to get him on quite a bit, including Hope. It looks like we'll have him on at some point this week. The home field advantage in that beautiful stadium with the atmosphere. I even saw a couple of people who follow K-State that were there. I remember when Baylor was there with that double overtime or whatever that was game that just could not stop talking enough about it. How much is that advantage?
Well, it feels like it's worth a few points these days because all of the turmoil and the tumult and the havoc and the disruption and the penalties and the turnovers from a K-State perspective, they were all happening, if you remember, on that end of the field. That's the student section end of the field. Everything was happening kind of inside the 30-yard line on Saturday night as they were backed up against the student section. They call the student section the ROC, R-O-C, Roar of Cougars. And that group was there and filled to the top row 2 hours before kick. Thousands of students filling that section. It's the loudest part of the stadium, and that's where things kind of get crazy. Whether it was Baylor in double overtime trying to score into that end zone in 2022, Arizona State that year had 4 or 5 or 6 false starts on that end of the field, or K-State kind of getting discombobulated on that end of the field. I think it's tough to argue that the atmosphere doesn't have a bit of an impact these days. The Cougs are used to playing at night. They get these late night calls. The place gets loud. There's an altitude thing to consider as well. There's how familiar are you with playing games at 8 or 9, your body clock time. BYU's used to it. Others may not be. A lot of things come together, but a Saturday night or a Friday night or a Thursday night at LaVell Edwards Stadium can be a pretty special thing. And the way the team is playing now and the way the crowds are selling out, I think it's a real thing.
Well, Greg, congratulations. Great win. Look forward to seeing you coming up Saturday. And this BYU Baylor series has kind of turned into a pretty good one. You know, it really has. And we'll see if BYU keeps rolling or if Baylor can bounce back from what was an atrocious and gut-wrenching loss if you're Dave Aranda and company. Thanks for your time and have a great rest of the week.
Always my pleasure. Love the Baylor BYU series. Again, I think I've told you in the past, the first ever BYU football game I witnessed in person was against Baylor back in 1984 in Provo. 2 games then, 2 games recently. The series continues. It's 2-2. Both teams win their home games, and a lot to play for this weekend, no doubt. Thanks again.
And now in the same conference, absolutely. Yeah. Greg Wrubell with his voice of BYU athletics.